Most people think World War II ended with a handshake, a signature, maybe some fireworks and a speech. But the last day of the war wasn't quiet, it wasn't clean, and it wasn't peaceful. It was hell. The final 24 hours before the surrender saw some of the most brutal violence the world had ever witnessed. Cities were still burning, bombs were still falling, soldiers were still dying, not because they had to, but because no one told them to stop. Some nations made last-second land grabs, others carried out revenge killings. A few simply refused to believe it was over. And in the middle of it all were people, ordinary civilians, crushed by the final wave of a storm they thought had already passed. In Germany, the streets of Berlin weren't silent. In Japan, entire cities were erased. And on the Eastern Front, the Soviet army wasn't slowing down, it was speeding up. Because even when the ink is drying on a surrender, ambition doesn't wait, neither does fear or hate. This is the story of how a war ended, not with peace, but with one last explosion of chaos, the kind of violence that doesn't make it into textbooks, the kind that leaves scars long after the flags are folded. So before we look back at parades and medals, we need to go to the edge, to the last 24 hours, when World War II was technically over, but the killing wasn't. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And if you're into stories that rewrite what you thought you knew about history, subscribe. We're just getting started. The official story says World War II ended on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. But that's just when the ink hit paper. The killing didn't stop when the generals signed the surrender. In fact, some of the bloodiest scenes happened after the documents were already sealed. Because across Eastern Europe, the Red Army wasn't celebrating. It was advancing. Stalin had no intention of slowing down. Soviet troops kept pushing west, steamrolling through what was left of Nazi territory, rounding up Germans, storming towns, and settling scores that had been simmering for 4 brutal years. In Czechoslovakia, German troops and civilians were being hunted, not just by Soviets but by Czech partisans who had been waiting years for this moment. In towns like Prague, fighting broke out that had nothing to do with orders and everything to do with revenge. German soldiers were shot in the street after surrendering. Civilians were pulled from homes and executed, and no one came to stop it because technically the war was already over. But there was no peace yet, just momentum. And that momentum was deadly. The same thing was happening all over Eastern Europe, in Poland, Hungary, Austria. Thousands of people who had nothing to do with battle lines were swept up in a final wave of vengeance. And behind the chaos, a quiet truth. The victors didn't just want the war to end. They wanted to reshape the world while everyone else was still reeling. The clock had stopped, but the consequences had just begun. In northern Germany, the surrender had already been signed. But just miles away, entire towns hadn't gotten the message. Communications were fractured. Commanders were scattered. And in some places, units were still receiving orders from men who were already dead. In the port city of Lübeck, Soviet bombers hit targets well past midnight, long after Germany's unconditional surrender. Why? Because the Soviets didn't trust the signatures. They wanted control, not just compliance. Further south in the hills of Czechoslovakia, the last official German unit was still fighting. The 7th Waffen-SS Volunteer Mountain Division. They hadn't surrendered. They were surrounded, and they were desperate. These weren't idealistic soldiers. These were hardened, cornered men, some of them just teenagers, who knew they were fighting not to win, but to avoid Soviet capture. They had seen what happened when the Red Army moved in, and surrender didn't always mean survival, so they kept shooting. Civilians who tried to leave were caught in the crossfire. Villages that had already welcomed liberation found themselves under siege again. It was like time broke. One side celebrating, the other side dying. And then there was the terror of friendly fire. Allied pilots in the skies over Europe were still flying missions. Some didn't know the war was over, others did, but still dropped payloads anyway. It's hard to turn off a global machine of death in one night, especially when the maps are outdated, the targets are vague, and the motives are shifting. The peace had begun, but no one knew how to live inside it yet. Surrender should have been the safest word in the world that day, but in the final hours of World War II, it might have been the deadliest, because not everyone who surrendered was spared, and not everyone believed the surrender was real. Across Germany, thousands of soldiers were trying to reach British or American lines before the Soviets could find them. Entire columns of Wehrmacht troops tossed their weapons, raised white flags, and marched west in silence, not to fight, but to escape. But they weren't always welcomed. Allied forces were overwhelmed with prisoners. Roads were jammed with refugees, tanks, and surrendering battalions all moving at once. Confusion was everywhere. Some surrendering units were mistaken for ambushes. Others were gunned down deliberately, especially if they belonged to the SS. Surrender didn't guarantee mercy. It just made you a target with empty hands. And for civilians, the picture was worse. German towns filled with women, children, and elderly men braced for whoever arrived first. In some places, American and British troops brought discipline and aid. In others, Soviet troops brought destruction. Rape, looting, and executions followed them like smoke. Stalin had unleashed his army with a promise: crush fascism. And many soldiers interpreted that as vengeance without limits. Even German anti-Nazi resistance members, people who had risked everything to fight Hitler from the inside, were not spared if they wore the wrong uniform. The war may have ended politically, but not emotionally, not morally. For millions of people in that final 24 hours, surrender wasn't an escape, it was a sentence. While Europe was stumbling toward silence, the Pacific was still screaming. Japan hadn't surrendered, not yet. And in those final hours, the violence there reached a level that felt almost unreal. On the island of Okinawa, the last major battle of the war was entering its bloodiest phase. The American military had been grinding through Japanese resistance for weeks, and the Japanese soldiers, many barely more than boys, were told that capture meant torture, dishonor, or worse. So they didn't surrender. They charged. They set off grenades in their own hands. They dragged civilians into caves and died beside them. On the last day, thousands of Japanese troops launched desperate banzai attacks, suicidal rushes meant to kill as many Americans as possible before death. It wasn't strategy, it was ritualized despair. The hills ran with mud and blood. But the horror wasn't limited to the battlefield. Civilians, terrified by propaganda, were throwing themselves off cliffs. Mothers smothered their own babies to avoid detection. Entire villages vanished overnight. And still, Tokyo refused to surrender. In fact, in the final hours, the Japanese high command was preparing for an even worse plan: to arm every man, woman, and child with bamboo spears and fight the Allies to the last island. They called it Ketsugo, the decisive operation. But what was coming wasn't a final stand. It was something darker. The atomic bomb was already being tested. The Emperor hadn't spoken yet, and the world was one breath away from fire. The Pacific Theater wasn't winding down, it was winding up. In the final days before Japan's surrender, the most terrifying violence wasn't just on the battlefield, it was in the shadows of cities that were already dying. As American bombers flew overhead and supply lines collapsed, Japan's military leadership ordered something that still shocks historians today. It was called the Kill-All Order, and it wasn't about the enemy, it was about the prisoners. Allied POWs, scattered across camps in Japanese-occupied territories, soldiers, medics, nurses, missionaries, even teenage volunteers, were marked for execution. Not trial, not transfer, execution. The logic was brutal. If Japan lost, the Allies would rescue the prisoners. If Japan killed them first, they couldn't be used as leverage. And so, across Asia, prison camps turned into slaughterhouses. In the Philippines, 150 American nurses, known as the Angels of Bataan, were nearly executed by retreating forces. In Palawan, Allied POWs were herded into air raid shelters. Then the shelters were set on fire. Guards shot anyone who tried to escape. Only 11 men survived out of 150. In other camps, prisoners were poisoned, bayoneted, buried alive, and some were simply starved, with their guards fleeing before they died. These weren't rogue actions. They were part of a system unraveling with violence. Japan's commanders knew the war was lost, but they were determined that their defeat would not be clean. It would leave scars, permanent ones. And in that final 24 hours, many prisoners didn't even know that peace had been signed, because for them, peace never arrived. You'd think once a surrender is signed, the killing stops. But in some places, surrender was just a pause, a technicality, before the next round of executions. That's what happened in Yugoslavia. As the war ended, German forces, Croatian fascists, and anti-communist soldiers from all over Eastern Europe began to retreat, hoping to surrender to the British Army in Austria. They didn't want to be captured by the communist partisans under Tito, who were now claiming victory. But when the Allies turned them away, sending them back across the border, thousands were slaughtered. What followed was known as the Bleiburg repatriations, a slow-motion massacre hidden behind bureaucratic silence. Columns of surrendered men, some armed, some not, were handed over, marched into forests and shot. Entire trenches were filled with bodies. In some villages, women and children disappeared too, and no one talked about it for decades. Meanwhile, back in Japan, something even darker was underway. In early August, long after Germany had surrendered, American bombers dropped napalm on over 60 Japanese cities. Everyone knows Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but almost no one knows about Toyama, a city nearly leveled in one night by firebombs so hot they melted steel. Hundreds of thousands burned alive, most of them civilians, most of them asleep. These weren't nuclear strikes. These were conventional bombs. But the result was the same. The war was technically ending, but on the ground, civilians were still choking on ash, bleeding in the rubble, and dying in cities that didn't even have air raid sirens anymore. The guns were slowing, but the terror wasn't. Because even after the front lines collapsed, the violence turned inward. In Germany, entire towns fell into panic, not from bombing raids, but from fear of what came next. Civilians who had supported Hitler now feared retribution. Women who had joined Nazi youth organizations were hunted by mobs. Suspected collaborators were shaved bald, paraded through streets, beaten in front of their neighbors. In France, this happened too. After liberation, there were waves of what historians now call the épuration sauvage, the savage purge. Resistance fighters dragged women from their homes and publicly humiliated them. Some were stripped, beaten, branded. Many were never officially charged with anything. Their crime? Dating a German soldier, or being related to someone who did. And no one stopped it. Because in that brief window after victory, when the rules were gone but justice hadn't arrived yet, revenge didn't need permission. Meanwhile, in Japan, civilians were living under a new kind of warfare, psychological collapse. The government had fed the population a steady diet of fear, telling them Americans would torture and massacre everyone when they landed. So entire towns began preparing for mass suicide. In Okinawa, grenades were handed out. In Kagoshima, families dug their own graves. Some didn't wait. They jumped from cliffs, drank poison, smothered their own children, not because of what was happening, but because of what they thought would happen. And that's the thing about the last day of war. It's not just about who died, it's about who broke, and how many never recovered. Some battles didn't end. They just disappeared from the headlines. Take the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. When the Nazis fell, the Soviets swept in to reclaim them. But the people there didn't welcome liberation. They remembered the deportations, the gulags, the purges from 1940. So even after Germany surrendered, a secret war continued. Thousands of armed locals, called the Forest Brothers, fled into the woods and launched guerrilla resistance against Soviet troops. The Soviets responded with brutal crackdowns, mass arrests, forced relocations, entire families sent to Siberia for collaboration. Schools were purged, churches shut down. In the official record, the war had ended. But in the forests, it had just begun. Elsewhere, in Poland and Czechoslovakia, Soviet liberators began cleansing towns. Not of Nazis, but of anyone who didn't fit the new regime. Intellectuals, priests, landowners, all quietly disappeared. Some were beaten to death in basements, others vanished into trains headed east, and no one came looking. Because the Allies had already moved on. In the West, victory parades filled the streets, soldiers kissed strangers in Times Square, newspapers called it peace. But for millions in the East, a new occupation had simply replaced the last one. The uniforms had changed. The fear hadn't. And while world leaders shook hands in front of cameras, entire countries were being rewritten behind barbed wire. That's the part no one celebrates. The part where peace didn't feel like freedom. It felt like being swallowed all over again. When the guns stopped firing, the world didn't just bury the dead, it buried the truth. Because the end of World War II wasn't just a cleanup, it was a recruitment drive. As Nazi scientists, officers, and intelligence agents tried to vanish into the smoke, something strange happened. Some of them didn't run. They were rescued. Operation Paperclip, launched by the United States, quietly smuggled over 1,600 Nazi scientists out of Europe. These were not just harmless engineers. Some had built the V-2 rockets that flattened London. Others had overseen slave labor or stood beside SS commanders at executions. And yet, by the summer of 1945, many were sipping coffee in New Mexico, helping design American missiles. Why? Because the Cold War was starting before the last war had even cooled. The US didn't want these mines falling into Soviet hands. So morality was quietly sidelined, and it wasn't just the Americans. The Soviets did it too, recruiting Nazi specialists, rewarding them with protection, resources, and fresh identities. In Argentina, high-ranking Nazis like Adolf Eichmann disappeared into quiet suburban neighborhoods, aided by secret networks and sympathetic governments. Justice, it turned out, had an expiration date. For the average citizen, the war was over, but for those with secrets or skills, it was just a negotiation. The world wanted closure. What it got was compromise. And in that final 24 hours, as surrender documents were signed and nations cheered, some of the worst war criminals in history were already being offered jobs. Not trials, contracts. The war may have ended on paper, but in the halls of power, no one was celebrating. They were calculating. Because the end of World War II was also the beginning of something new and terrifying. The moment Germany surrendered, the fragile alliance between the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union began to crack. They had fought together, but they had never truly trusted each other. And now, with Hitler gone, the question became, who gets what? Who controls what? And how far are we willing to go to keep it? In Berlin, the city was split into 4 zones: American, British, French, Soviet. But this wasn't neat. It was tense. Soldiers stared each other down at checkpoints. Intelligence agents followed each other through rubble. Rumors of sabotage and spying started before the dust even settled. And in the Pacific, things were worse. The US knew they would have to invade Japan if surrender didn't come fast. And every hour that passed meant more soldiers preparing for what they called Operation Downfall, the invasion plan that could have cost up to 1 million lives. So, yes, the war was over, but generals were still drawing battle maps, scientists were still racing to finish a new weapon, politicians were still making secret promises they didn't plan to keep. Even as flags were raised and champagne popped, there was a sense of dread. Like peace wasn't really peace, just a pause before a different kind of war, one colder, quieter, but just as dangerous. While Europe cheered and Japan braced, one of the deadliest consequences of the war's final days was unfolding in silence, in a place no one was watching. It wasn't a battlefield, it was a supply line, and it was collapsing. In Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and China, regions already racked by colonialism and war, millions of civilians were dying, not from bullets, from hunger. Infrastructure had shattered, ports were bombed, crops were destroyed, and colonial powers like Britain and France, obsessed with reclaiming their empires, diverted food supplies away from starving civilians to feed their militaries. In British-ruled India, the Bengal famine, which had begun in 1943, still hadn't ended. In fact, the final days of the war saw entire villages abandoned, families reduced to bone and silence, bodies left unburied on roadsides. Over 3 million people died while ships full of grain sat in harbors or were rerouted to British troops. Churchill was warned. He said it wasn't his responsibility. In Vietnam, the Japanese military had seized rice stores to feed their war machine. When Allied bombers destroyed the railway system, food couldn't move. People ate bark, then rats, then each other. Nearly 2 million Vietnamese died in the shadow of a war that was supposed to be ending. And when Japan surrendered, no one rushed to feed them. There were no aid drops, no headlines, just the quiet starvation of people who didn't matter to the victors. This was the real end of World War II, not a parade, but a famine. One no one talks about. As the world screamed peace, another war quietly ignited, not over land or oil, but identity. Because in the final hours of World War II, millions of people had no country to return to. They were stateless, and many were suddenly in danger, not for crimes, but for being on the wrong side of a collapsing border. Across Eastern Europe, ethnic Germans, even those who had lived for generations in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, were now labeled enemies. They hadn't fought for Hitler, many hated him, but that didn't matter. After surrender, mobs formed, government orders were issued, and a campaign of mass expulsion began. Entire towns were emptied. Men were dragged from homes. Women were assaulted. Children disappeared during forced marches. Trains packed beyond capacity carried families into relocation zones, but many never made it. They died of exposure, starvation, or violence. Historians estimate 12 to 14 million Germans were displaced. At least 500,000 died. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The Allies knew. In fact, at the Potsdam Conference, Churchill, Truman, and Stalin agreed to orderly and humane population transfers. But there was nothing orderly or humane about it. No process, no protection, just vengeance disguised as justice. And it wasn't just Germans. Across the Balkans, Turks were expelled. Jews who had survived the Holocaust returned home, only to find their houses taken, their neighbors hostile, and pogroms starting again. The war had ended, but the hatred, that still had momentum. And it didn't stop at the border. In the hours after surrender, a strange quiet fell over much of Europe. Not peace, just stillness. As the guns went silent, cities that had been shelled for years stood frozen, their people unsure what came next. For some, it felt like waking up in someone else's house. German officers disappeared, local officials fled, and into the vacuum poured something worse than fear, uncertainty. In Vienna, Prague, and Budapest, Soviet soldiers roamed the streets unchecked. In Paris and Brussels, police stations struggled to reopen. Prisons were emptied, border crossings vanished, and for a few days, maybe even weeks, there was no one in charge. That silence didn't bring calm. It brought looting, retaliation, chaos. Entire black markets sprang up overnight, powered by abandoned Nazi supply chains and desperate civilians. Allied soldiers, tired, traumatized, often drunk, patrolled towns they didn't recognize, unsure who was friend or foe. Some offered chocolate to children, others took what they wanted from women. In Berlin, civilians broke into bunkers looking for food, water, or gold teeth still lodged in burned corpses. In Warsaw, people dug through rubble looking for furniture. In Naples, the mafia stepped in where law collapsed, offering protection in exchange for loyalty, and creating the power structures that would dominate Italy for decades. Everyone thought the hardest part was over, but peace, it turns out, doesn't start with a signature. It starts with rebuilding trust. And in that quiet window between war and order, trust was the one thing nobody could afford. There's a strange danger in a collapsing regime. It creates ghosts, not just of the dead, but of the powerful. And in the last day of World War II, as the Nazi Empire disintegrated, those ghosts scattered across Europe. High-ranking officers changed uniforms. SS men burned documents and shaved their heads. War criminals disappeared into the crowds of refugees, swapping medals for fake names. But some didn't run. They turned on their own. In the final 48 hours, hundreds of Nazi officials executed their subordinates to cover their tracks. Secretaries were shot. Drivers were hanged. Prisoners were liquidated. Not because they posed a threat, but because they'd seen too much. In Austria, Nazi commanders destroyed entire bunkers full of records. In Norway, collaborators burned files for days, sometimes while local police looked the other way. In Denmark, prison guards released inmates to hide the overcrowded camps that had housed political prisoners for years. And all over Germany, regional Gauleiters, Nazi governors, either fled or committed suicide, leaving power in limbo. In towns like Leipzig, Nazi youth groups still patrolled the streets even after surrender, not because they were fighting, because no one told them to stop. These weren't battles anymore. They were spirals, spirals of fear, desperation, and unfinished business. And in that final moment, the scariest thing wasn't the gunfire. It was the silence afterward, when you realized the people who had ruled you, terrorized you, killed your neighbors, were just gone. And they had left no answers, just bodies and ashes. While the world burned above, Hitler spent his final hours underground. In a cramped concrete bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, surrounded by collapsing walls and crumbling allies, the most powerful man in Germany prepared to vanish, not into exile, into legend. It was April 30th, 1945, days before the official surrender, but for the Third Reich, it was already over. Soviet artillery was shaking Berlin. The Red Army was just blocks away. And inside the Führer bunker, the last rituals were underway. Hitler dictated his final will, married Eva Braun in a short, private ceremony, handed out cyanide pills like party favors, then locked himself in a room and pulled the trigger. His body, along with Eva's, was doused in gasoline and set alight in the garden above, not for symbolic reasons, but because he feared what Stalin would do to his corpse. But the violence didn't end with his death. It got stranger. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, poisoned his 6 children while they slept, then shot his wife and himself. Other officials fled into tunnels. Some tried to negotiate with the Soviets. Some shot themselves in empty corridors. The bunker, once the nerve center of the Nazi regime, became a graveyard of failed loyalties. Outside, the Soviets didn't even know for sure that Hitler was dead. Rumors swirled. Some believed he escaped. Others claimed his double had died in his place. But one thing was certain. The man who started the war had ended it not with glory, but with smoke, bone, and silence. Berlin didn't fall. It disintegrated. By the time Soviet troops swarmed into the city on May 2nd, 1945, it wasn't a capital. It was a carcass. Buildings were blackened skeletons, roads were rubble, sewage flowed through the streets, fires still burned in places no one could reach, and somewhere under it all were more than 1 million civilians, starved, stunned, and trapped. The city had been pounded by artillery for weeks. Bomb craters became graves. Entire hospitals collapsed. Electricity was gone. Water was gone. Food had been reduced to rats and wallpaper paste scraped from the walls. But the worst wasn't over. It was just arriving, on tanks marked with red stars. Soviet troops entered Berlin like a wave. Some came as liberators, but others came as avengers. The Eastern Front had taught them cruelty. They had seen villages razed, comrades burned alive, their own families slaughtered by the Nazis. And now, in Berlin, with victory in their hands and no one to stop them, many took revenge. Over the next few days, an estimated 100,000 women were raped. Girls, grandmothers, nuns, starving mothers who had hidden in basements. Some women were assaulted more than once in a single night by soldiers who couldn't even speak their language. By the time the Allies arrived, suicide rates had skyrocketed, pharmacies ran out of poison, rivers filled with bodies, and the survivors didn't speak of it. They couldn't, because in the wreckage of a city that once claimed to be the heart of a 1,000-year Reich, there were no victors, just ghosts. While Berlin smoldered, another war was already beginning. One fought in whispers, shadows, and interrogation rooms. In every country the Soviets liberated, a new rulebook was quietly being written, and it didn't include freedom. In Poland, resistance fighters who had spent years fighting Nazis were arrested by Soviet agents the moment the Germans surrendered. Their crime, not surrendering to Moscow. In Romania and Bulgaria, monarchies were stripped, political parties dissolved, and press outlets shut down. Elections were promised, and then rigged before the first vote was cast. In Hungary, priests who had helped hide Jews from the Nazis were now imprisoned by Stalin's secret police. Because mercy was not a feature of this new world, control was, and the people who had suffered under one dictatorship now found themselves trapped in another. The uniforms changed, the methods didn't. Neighbors informed on each other. Teachers were fired for using the wrong map. Children were taught to love their country and fear their parents. And it started fast. Even before the end of the war, Soviet operatives were planting flags, rewriting laws, and creating puppet governments in the ruins of Europe. There was no pause, no debate, no democracy. And by the time the Western Allies realized what was happening, half the continent was already they didn't even see being built. The Nazis had ruled with violence. Stalin ruled with silence. And for millions of people, the last day of World War II didn't feel like peace. It felt like a curtain had dropped, and everything behind it went dark. While Europe stared at rubble, the Pacific pointed its eyes to the sky and didn't know what was coming. Because even as Japan's navy sank, its cities burned, and its empire shrank to ashes, the government refused to surrender. Unconditional surrender was still considered worse than death. And so, in the final hours, the United States made a decision that changed history, not with strategy, but with a single plane. On August 6, 1945, just after 8:15 a.m., a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped a 9,700-pound bomb called Little Boy over the city of Hiroshima. No warning, no negotiation, just silence, and then light. The blast leveled everything within a mile instantly. It crushed bones, incinerated skin, and vaporized human beings so completely they left nothing behind but shadows etched into stone. Over 80,000 people were killed within seconds. Tens of thousands more died in the days and weeks that followed from burns, radiation, and organ failure. The firestorm melted glass. Rivers filled with bodies. Children wandered the ruins with no faces. And even then, even after that, Japan didn't surrender. The government still debated, still hesitated, still argued over whether surrender was even honorable. So 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And only then, only after the unimaginable became reality, did the emperor finally speak. For the first time in Japanese history, the emperor's voice was broadcast to the people. And in that voice, layered beneath diplomacy and sorrow, was a truth no nation had heard before. We are no longer in control of what man can do. Japan's surrender didn't arrive like a curtain falling. It arrived like a secret being smuggled out of a burning building. Because even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even after Soviet forces invaded Manchuria and crushed Japan's last hope of mediation, not everyone in Tokyo agreed it was over. Inside the imperial palace, chaos brewed beneath the stillness. The Emperor Hirohito had made his decision. He would surrender. But the military wasn't ready to follow. In fact, some officers were prepared to overthrow their own government to stop it. On the night of August 14th, a group of die-hard officers launched a coup. Their goal: silence the emperor before his surrender message could be broadcast to the public. They cut phone lines, took over the Imperial Guard, stormed the palace grounds. But what they didn't count on was how carefully the emperor's advisors had planned for this moment. The surrender speech, pre-recorded on a vinyl record, was already hidden. Loyal guards protected the broadcasting station. And in the middle of the night, as rebel officers searched the palace, they found nothing but locked rooms and quiet corridors. By morning, the coup had failed. Several rebels took their own lives. And on August 15th, at exactly noon, Japan turned on its radios and heard something no one had ever heard before: the voice of the divine. The emperor, emotionless and measured, told his people to accept the unacceptable, to endure the unendurable. And in that moment, the war, the global, endless, burning war, was finally over. On paper, but not in memory, not even close. The day after the emperor's voice crackled across Japan's radios, there were no parades, no flags, no cheers, just silence. A nation built on obedience, ritual, and honor had just been told to kneel. Some couldn't accept it. Some chose suicide over surrender. Whole families walking into the sea, officers disemboweling themselves in back rooms, young men drinking cyanide beside shrines. But most people didn't die. They waited for food that wasn't coming, for soldiers who wouldn't return, for a war that had already killed so much of their world to tell them what came next. And what came wasn't peace, it was hunger. Japan's cities were in ruins. Rice fields had been destroyed. Millions were homeless. In Tokyo alone, over 3 million civilians were displaced. In Hiroshima, survivors wandered like ghosts, burned, blinded, with skin falling from their arms, their own families too terrified to embrace them. And as surrender turned into occupation, fear turned into uncertainty. American planes, once agents of death, now dropped leaflets. American soldiers, once imagined as monsters, now handed out chewing gum. Children bowed to them in the streets. Old men wept while planting vegetables where their homes once stood. The war was over, but the country didn't know who it was anymore. Not a divine empire, not a global power, just ashes and memory. And for the first time, the people of Japan had to live without answers, only questions. What did it all mean? What had they fought for? And could anything at all, be built from the ruins left behind? Across Europe, the word liberation sounded noble. But for the people coming out of camps, cellars, and forests, freedom didn't feel like a parade. It felt like stepping into the daylight after years underground, blind, shaking, and unsure if it was even real. In April 1945, U.S. troops marched into Buchenwald, Dachau, Mauthausen. British forces reached Bergen-Belsen. What they found wasn't humanity. It was the afterimage of a genocide. Barracks filled with skeletal figures too weak to stand. Corpses stacked like firewood. Entire rooms filled with ash, bone, and shoes. The liberators cried, vomited, took photos because no one would believe what they saw. But for the survivors, Jews, Romani, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, gay men, liberation was complicated. Some didn't cheer. They stared. Some refused food. their stomachs unable to process kindness. Some collapsed the moment they stepped outside the gates, because their bodies weren't just broken, their souls were rearranged. And after the cameras left, they faced a new question. Go where? The camps didn't just vanish. Many were converted into displaced persons camps, where survivors stayed for months, sometimes years. Some had no families to return to. Others were turned away by their own hometowns. In Poland, a group of Jewish survivors returned to Kielce, only to be murdered in a pogrom in 1946. They had survived the Nazis, and then were killed by their neighbors. Because war doesn't just leave behind ruins. It leaves behind the parts of society that allowed the horror to happen. And for the survivors, freedom came with a haunting realization. Even after the camps, they still weren't safe. As the Allies moved deeper into Europe, they didn't just find camps, they found silence. And underneath that silence, pits, mass graves freshly covered. Some disguised as farmland, others hidden in forests, behind barbed wire, or at the edge of factories that still smelled like ash. These weren't battlefields, they were execution sites, places like Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, where almost no one survived, where trains arrived full and left empty. No liberation happened there, just excavation. And what they uncovered wasn't just genocide, it was industrialized death. Gas chambers disguised as showers, carbon monoxide pumped in from tank engines, gold fillings ripped from mouths, hair shorn for insulation, and records, meticulous records, listing names, weights, teeth, even the number of shoes. The Nazis hadn't just killed people, they'd turned it into logistics. But the worst part, some of the locals knew. Villagers in nearby towns admitted the air smelled like burning flesh. Some claimed they had no idea. Others confessed they were warned not to speak. Many had watched trainloads of people vanish and said nothing. And now the Allies had to decide what came next. Trials, tribunals, execution. At Nuremberg, a stage was set. But the world had never prosecuted a crime this massive. There was no script for genocide, no legal category for evil that precise. And the question lingered. Could you punish a nation's silence? Could justice exist for 6 million people who were dust? Or would this, all of it, end in history books, while the survivors were left to carry the weight alone? When the Nuremberg trials began in late 1945, the world held its breath. For the first time in history, leaders of a defeated nation would face charges not just for losing a war, but for crimes against humanity. 24 Nazi officials sat in the dock, generals, ministers, ideologues, architects of extermination. Some were defiant, others broken. All were watched by a jury of nations still bleeding from the war. The evidence was overwhelming. Footage from concentration camps, ledgers from death factories, testimonies from survivors that left entire courtrooms frozen. But behind the scenes, even the victors were uneasy. Because Nuremberg wasn't just about judgment, it was about precedent. And the questions being asked cut both ways. If Germany was guilty of invasion, what about Stalin's conquest of Poland? If chemical weapons were a crime, what about firebombing Dresden or Hiroshima? The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were all sitting in judgment, but none of them were innocent, and they knew it. Justice in Nuremberg walked a tightrope between morality and politics. Some Nazis were sentenced to death, others were quietly recruited by Allied governments. Werner von Braun, the mastermind behind Nazi rockets, would go on to lead NASA. Kurt Waldheim, an officer who served in Nazi units, became Secretary General of the United Nations. For the victims, this wasn't justice, it was compromise. A war had ended, but the truth, that was still being negotiated. And as the courtroom emptied, one fact remained. Evil had been tried, but it had not been defeated, not entirely. By the time the dust settled, the numbers were almost impossible to process. Over 70 million people dead, Civilians made up more than half. Entire cities erased from maps, languages extinguished, families reduced to photographs no one could identify. But the real damage of World War II didn't end in graves. It echoed in the minds of those who survived, and in the silence of those who never spoke again. In Japan, children born near Hiroshima were called hibakusha, bomb-affected people. Many faced discrimination, unable to marry, find work, or even speak about what they had seen without shame. In Germany, survivors of the camps returned home to find their houses occupied and their pain ignored. In France and the Netherlands, women who had been forced to collaborate, or simply accused of it, were paraded through towns, heads shaved, marked as traitors. The war had ended, but cruelty still wore a civilian face. Meanwhile, in Britain and America, soldiers came home with medals and trauma. Shell shock, now called PTSD, was everywhere but barely understood. Men who had stormed beaches, liberated camps, and burned through jungles were told to smile and go back to work. No therapy, no answers, just silence. And for many, the most violent part of the war wasn't the fighting. It was living afterward, in a world trying to move on while pretending none of it had happened. The last day of World War II may have closed the book on combat, but it opened a chapter that no treaty could erase. The chapter where memory became a battlefield too. The end of World War II didn't bring the world together, it split it in half. The victors, the US, Britain, the Soviet Union, stood shoulder to shoulder in public, but behind closed doors, the knives were already out. At the Yalta Conference, they had smiled for the cameras. At Potsdam, they barely spoke. By 1946, the alliance that defeated Hitler had transformed into a quiet standoff, and soon a global chessboard. The Cold War didn't begin with bombs. It began with borders. Germany was carved into pieces, east and west. Berlin, too, a city divided by ideology, barbed wire, and fear. In the east, Stalin tightened his grip. In the west, America poured in money, the Marshall Plan, not just to rebuild Europe, but to keep it from turning red. Eastern Europe became a buffer zone of puppet states. Western Europe became an economic fortress of American influence. The Iron Curtain wasn't a metaphor, it was a blueprint. In Asia, Japan surrendered, but was occupied by the US-China descended into civil war. Korea was split at the 38th parallel. Vietnam, still under French control, smoldered with resistance. Everywhere the war had touched, the wounds weren't healing. They were being recut along new lines. Capitalism versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship, and all of it powered by the lingering hunger to never be vulnerable again. World War II was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but in its final day, it lit the fuse of another, colder, quieter, but no less dangerous. The last day of World War II closed with silence. But beneath that silence, something was growing. Something far more terrifying than anything seen before. The atomic bomb didn't just end the war. It changed the meaning of war itself. Within months of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world realized the battlefield no longer required soldiers, just scientists. The US had the bomb, but Stalin wanted it too. And behind closed doors, Soviet spies were already inside the Manhattan Project, smuggling secrets, blueprints, and formulas. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first nuke. The arms race had begun, and what followed wasn't peace, it was escalation. In America, fallout shelters were advertised like household appliances. School children practiced duck-and-cover drills under desks that couldn't stop a breeze, let alone a fireball. In the USSR, cities were redesigned for nuclear defense. Entire mountain bunkers were carved out in secret. The two superpowers never declared war. But they built enough bombs to destroy the planet 100 times over, and then aimed them at each other. They called it mutually assured destruction, but the madness didn't stop there. The US detonated hydrogen bombs. The Soviets tested the Tsar Bomba. the most powerful explosion in human history. What began as a world war ended as a waiting game. A game with no winners, just fingers on buttons. And while the world above smiled in parades and rebuilt cities, the world below was digging deeper, hiding missiles, writing contingency plans, because the war hadn't ended. It had only moved underground. After the last bombs fell and the last treaties were signed, something strange began to happen. Countries didn't just rebuild, they rewrote. History, it turned out, was another battlefield, and every nation needed to win it. In Germany, the rubble was cleared, but the past was buried deeper. Former Nazis quietly reintegrated. Some became politicians, others became judges. Entire school curriculum skipped over the camps. The phrase wasn't genocide, it was the war. And for years, denial wrapped itself around national pride like a tourniquet. In Japan, the surrender was real, but the responsibility was blurred. School textbooks removed references to comfort women, massacres, and Unit 731. The atomic bomb became the story, not Nanking, not Manchuria. Victimhood replaced accountability, and for a generation students were taught a version of the war where Japan lost, but never really committed atrocities. In Russia, the Soviet Union cast itself as the hero of Europe, the great vanquisher of fascism. But the gulags, the secret police, the mass executions of Polish officers at Katyn, never mentioned. The Red Army liberated. The Red Army never raped, never purged, never occupied. And in the United States, World War II became the good war, the righteous war, the last clean victory. But Dresden, Hiroshima, the internment of Japanese Americans, those were footnotes. Because every country needed a story it could live with, even if it wasn't true. And so the most violent war in human history didn't just end with treaties. It ended with narratives. Narratives that shaped generations and left the truth to collect dust in the margins. Decades passed. Soldiers became grandfathers. Ruins became shopping malls. Camps became museums. The world moved on, or pretended to. But World War II never really ended. It just went quiet, and in that silence, the world tried to make sense of what it had done. Memorials rose in Berlin, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, Normandy. Politicians gave speeches, presidents laid wreaths. But even as they said, never again, the seeds of something darker were stirring. Because time doesn't heal everything, it forgets, and forgetting is dangerous. In the Balkans, the ghosts of fascism returned in the 1990s. In Rwanda, in Darfur, in Syria, genocide happened again, not on the same scale, but with the same tools: propaganda, dehumanization, silence. Even in the West, the rhetoric began to echo: slow, subtle, familiar, nationalism, ethnic purity, the language of us and them. As the last survivors of the Holocaust died, the world began losing its witnesses. Memory became secondhand. Truth became debatable. Holocaust denial crept into forums. Textbooks were rewritten. Wars were branded as peacekeeping. And again, silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of complicity. Because the last day of World War II wasn't just about bombs or surrender. It was about what the world allowed, what it justified, and what it promised never to become again. Promises, it turns out, are easy to make when the smoke is still rising, harder to keep when comfort returns. And now, as the generation who lived through it fades away, the final question stands taller than ever. Did we learn anything at all?